Thank you, Phil, for the introduction. That was very kind. And it's wonderful to be here this morning and see so many of my colleagues up bright and early. And I'm really looking forward to spending the rest of the day at the conference and seeing what everybody's working on. I'm going to talk about opioid use disorder as something that's near and dear to my heart. This slide just shows some highlights from some newspaper articles. You can't pick up the newspaper or turn on the radio or TV without hearing about the opioid crisis each day. And unfortunately, despite a lot of concerted effort, things seem to still be going in the wrong direction, with our deaths and complications increasing with each year. So we're trying to figure out how to stem the tide of this crisis. And so I'm going to talk about trying to tackle the crisis with science. These are my disclosures related to past research funding. And this is the outline of my talk. Today I'm going to describe the progression of the opioid epidemic in the United States. I think everybody knows a little bit about how it started, but I want to update everybody on where it stands right now. I want to review some studies that can inform opioid product regulation and review studies that inform how pharmacology translates to clinical outcomes. And finally, describe some data from recent studies that have been conducted here at the University of Kentucky on novel formulations for the treatment of opioid use disorder. This slide is an older slide that illustrates really the beginning of the opioid crisis. And what you're looking at in the three lines are the rates of prescription opioid sales as sales increased across the country. In green, the rate of deaths from opioid overdose in purple, and then substance abuse treatment admissions in which the person presenting for treatment specified that they were presenting because of an opioid use disorder. And you can see that all of these are climbing in parallel, and that the sales and availability of opioids on the streets actually helped to propel this. When this crisis began, I had already landed here at the University of Kentucky, and we were having a big problem with a lot of pain pills coming into Kentucky from Florida. My colleague Michelle Lawful and I were dispatched to go down to Florida and do some training for physicians who were trying to treat opioid use disorder. And this is what we found. These advertisements for healthcare. They don't look like typical advertisements for healthcare, but I can tell you that we picked up some free magazines, and there were hundreds of these advertisements. And you can see from the pictures, there's kind of this come hither look, stop the pain, we'll give you 1% off, there's coupons, we'll give you free transportation, and also they'll dispense your medications right on site. So this is not typical of an advertisement for clinical practice. When I'm looking for a doctor, this is not what is appealing to me. But what had happened was that in Florida, they were one of the few states that didn't have a prescription drug monitoring program. At the time, their governor didn't think that they needed one. And that allowed for an incredible explosion of pill mill pain clinics. So between August of 2008 and November of 2009, it's a very short time, a new pain clinic opened on average every 3 days in just Broward and Palm Beach counties alone. So the increase went from 4 pain clinics in 2007 to 291 in 2009 in just these 2 counties alone. So there was a bus service that was arranged so people could leave Kentucky with x-rays, not their own, go down, get in line, and then return to Kentucky with very large bottles of oxycodone, Xanax, and hydrocodone. And then their sponsor, who helped pay for their bus ride, would get a portion of that, and the rest would end up on the streets. So this really was all driven by profiteering and unscrupulous marketing practices. And of course, everybody knows about Purdue Pharma because OxyContin was kind of a key element that started the whole crisis. To date, Purdue Pharma has paid $635 million back to the federal government for misbranding and settled numerous class action lawsuits and lawsuits with states and individuals. This is still ongoing. Just 2 months ago, they announced that they are going to stop promoting opioids and cut their sales staff. So they're doing the right thing. This is what they're advertising to the US population and to the FDA. We've restructured and significantly reduced our commercial operation and will no longer be promoting opioids to prescribers. But during the same time, Purdue has reinvented themselves as a company called Mundi Pharma. And Mundi Pharma doesn't operate in the US. Mundi Pharma operates in basically every other country aside from the US. And what they're doing in South America and Europe and Asia is the exact same thing that they did here in the United States. They're out marketing directly to doctors, telling people that opioids are not dangerous, they're not addictive. And the head of their emerging markets has said publicly that pain treatment in Asia is 1/50th of what it should be. And by pushing opioids overseas, Mundi Pharma has increased the sales 800% over the last 5 years. So this is a crisis that's still underway, and it's actually spreading. These are the most recent data from the CDC. These are age-adjusted overdose death rates. And the states that are in the dark colors are the ones that have the highest rates of overdose. And you can see that Kentucky is right in the middle of the cluster. Tennessee, West Virginia, Ohio, and Indiana, all of our partner states, are the worst affected. What's happened since the original onset of the epidemic with prescription opioids per se that were hitting the illegal market is that heroin has been introduced into virtually every community in the country. When I first came here in 2005, no one used heroin. When we brought people in for our studies, there was no experience with heroin. Everyone was using opioid pills. But the creation of a whole population of people who were addicted to pain pills led to a great sales opportunity to bring heroin to places that it hadn't been before. And all this is documented very nicely in Sam Quinones' book called Dreamland. And if you haven't read it, it's a very interesting treatise on the pizza delivery sales model of heroin in poor regions of this country. Now, the real crisis that we're facing are new illicit opioids that are flooding our streets. And you probably have heard about fentanyl. So fentanyl is 50 to 100 times more potent than heroin. This is the drug that if a police officer arrests somebody and it's in their possession, they can inhale just a few grains of it, and then they can go down with respiratory depression themselves because it's so potent. We had a small blip in fentanyl overdoses in 2008, but that doesn't match anything to what's happening now. And this slide is data from the DEA that's on seizures when people are arrested. They test the drugs and see what's in them. And what you can see in this really steep increase on the far right is the increase in seizures for fentanyl itself. And now looking at the newest data from the CDC and Center on Health Statistics, this shows US overdose rates by opioid category. And the one that is the steepest at the end is actually the synthetic opioids, and this is fentanyl. And so this in large part accounts for why we saw a nearly 20% increase from last year, from 2016 to 2017 in overdose deaths. So I'm gonna move on then to talk about different ways that we may be able to tackle this crisis with the types of studies that we're able to do in the human laboratory and also in the human clinic. In this case, I'm going to talk about a study that we did a few years back where we approached it by looking at one opioid at a time. And hydrocodone is a full mu opioid agonist. If you're in practice at all, of course you know it. There's over 300 formulations of hydrocodone on the market in the US. It is the #1 selling drug in the US above everything else. It was placed in Schedule 3, which is a not as restrictive schedule for prescribing in the 1970s because it was suggested that hydrocodone was 30-fold less potent than morphine, which would mean that it was just a very weak opioid. And that Schedule 3 designation applied to combination products. If somebody had had a singular product of hydrocodone that had a much higher concentration, it would have fallen into Schedule 2. So marketers didn't do that. They just always kept the amount under, but then they would, you could prescribe volumes, very big bottles, so someone could actually exceed that dose. And about 15 years ago now, the DEA had petitioned the FDA to reschedule hydrocodone to make it more stringent. I became interested in this because when I read the report that it was 30 times less potent than morphine, I didn't really know where those data came from. And so I started looking, trying to understand what was different about hydrocodone. And what I discovered was that I really couldn't find any evidence to support that statement. And I think from a scientific kind of training standpoint, sometimes when you don't find an answer to something, often, it may be that this is just kind of an accepted lore, but actually there are no data for it. And then the next thing that you might want to do is get some data. So of course we wrote a grant. And we studied hydrocodone under a number of different conditions. And these are data, just a very simple slide, to show the comparison of hydrocodone against oxycodone and hydromorphone, which is dilaudid. And hydromorphone is accepted as having a very high abuse potential. And in this case, we're looking at different doses, and individuals who use opioids, who are participating in the study, are responding to all kinds of questions. In this one, they're being asked, how high are you right now, after they get all these various doses given, only one dose per day. And what we found under oral dose conditions was that hydrocodone really didn't look any different than any of the other opioids, except that it was in a different schedule. And we followed this up and looked at the drugs when given intravenously, and we found basically the same phenomena. And in this case, we compared morphine, and then we were able to do a relative potency comparison and found that rather than the 30-to-1 difference in potency, we found that the potency was about 1-to-1. So really they were roughly equivalent. And so with those data from some really fairly simple studies that were conjured up because we realized there was a gap in the literature, those data were a part of the subsequent FDA and DEA hearings about hydrocodone that led to its rescheduling into Schedule II. And sometimes people think scheduling doesn't actually make any difference, but it really does, because there are different requirements around refills and the needs for wet signatures and things like that. And these are data that were published very soon after the rescheduling, looking just at the first 4 quarters. And even within that short period of time, once the rescheduling took place, prescribing for hydrocodone products decreased by about 25%. And this is important because there were literally like 100 million prescriptions written per year. So a decrease of 25% is pretty significant. And my understanding, although I don't have more recent data, is that these numbers have continued to go down. So I want to talk a little bit about treatment for opioid use disorder, because I think that there are many ways to tackle this. We can stem the flow of prescribing, we can improve education, we can do prevention messages, but we already have a crisis with a lot of people who are already suffering from opioid use disorder and at risk for early death. And so I think one of the most important things that we need to do is expand treatment. Right now, fewer than 10% of the people who need treatment for opioid use disorder are able to access it. And this is for a whole variety of structural reasons related to insurance, provider availability, training, and stigma. At this time, about 140 people are dying of overdose each day in the United States, and the majority of those are out of treatment. So there are a number of barriers to expansion that include stigma around substance use disorders, the cost of treatment. ACA expansion has really helped because a lot of people are insured who otherwise weren't. We have a workforce problem in that addiction medicine is only really a newly recognized board for physicians. And then we have problems around misuse and diversion of agents like buprenorphine, that is the most widely used treatment in the country at this point. So there are a number of pharmacotherapeutic approaches that can be used to treat opioid use disorder. And we think of opioid use disorder as a chronic relapsing disease. In any other chronic disease, we would expect to provide ongoing treatment. We wouldn't expect that you would treat somebody for 4 weeks and then they would be better, if they had hypertension or diabetes, for example. So we're fortunate in our field because we actually have multiple agents that are approved by the FDA for use, and this is not the case for other substance use disorders. So we have methadone, naltrexone in a couple of different formulations, and a number of buprenorphine products. There are also some medications that are used for management of withdrawal for transition periods, including clonidine, which is off-label, and other opioids. And then at this point, there are novel approaches that are in development, such as vaccine therapies. So these are data from a study, a colleague of mine, Johan Kakko, in Sweden. And he was compelled to do this study at a time when the Swedish government was making it so difficult for people to access methadone treatment that people were dying while they were on the waiting list because they had such stringent criteria. So in this study, they compared individuals in a randomized trial who were assigned to receive buprenorphine daily versus those who did a quick taper on buprenorphine or a step down to get to a state of 0 milligrams. And the study was designed with very enriched psychosocial services. It doesn't really mimic even what happens in our typical treatment unit. They were given job help, they were given education, they were given housing assistance. And despite that, what you can see is that the patients who were assigned to buprenorphine remained in treatment to a great degree for the full year of the study, and that the majority had started dropping out as soon as the taper began, so that no one was left after 2 months in the detoxification arm. And during that time, 4 of the 20 people assigned to detoxification died. So this is a very high percentage of mortality for a relatively young population that is attributable to a treatment, which is detoxification. This study was completed in Sweden 15 years ago. And so I find myself asking, why is this the most common treatment? Because this is the most broadly employed treatment that we use in this country, despite the fact that we know there's no evidence to support its efficacy, and we know that it's actually harmful. And part of the reason for this is the split within the medical community around where addiction fits, right? So historically, it was a moral problem. Then it became a problem for self-help, like mutual aid, AA, and then now it's in medicine, but that's still not really integrated into our medical system. And that's what our keynote speaker today is going to spend a lot of time talking about. But one of the problems with this is that it takes a lot of the AA 12-step approach, which I'm not opposed to at all and works for many people, but treats opioids as though they're alcohol, and they are completely different things. So someone who's abstaining from alcohol and they have a slip one day, they're likely to be able to go to a meeting the next day and acknowledge that they slipped. But with opioids, if you have a relapse, there's a very good chance it's actually going to kill you because it's a very unforgiving disorder. So I want to talk about buprenorphine itself because, as I said, it's become the most widely used treatment. It's demonstrated efficacy across many, many trials. It's used worldwide at this point. It's very effective at suppressing opioid withdrawal symptoms. It produces a robust reduction of craving for opioids, which is a real trigger for relapse. And it produces blockade of opioids. And I'm going to show you an example of that when I go through the next couple of slides. All of these pharmacological features then act to reduce illicit drug use, which is what the target is for the treatment. And by reducing illicit drug use, this actually creates a sustained opportunity for patients to work on other things. Addiction is very complicated, so people don't come in just with addiction. Oftentimes, by the time they come to treatment, they've got housing issues, they've burned their bridges with their family, they've got medical complications. And if we can use buprenorphine to stabilize them and to get them to a place where they can actually begin to even think about anything else than their addiction, then we can begin to help them with their other problems. There's a very large scientific evidence base of efficacy, and buprenorphine is now on the World Health Organization's list of essential medicines, indicating that every country should have it available to treat this disorder. However, once buprenorphine was marketed, there were signals of buprenorphine abuse and misuse, and some bad pill mill providers did emerge. You can see this sign in front of the, this is at the Three Corners region, this is Big Stone Gap, for buprenorphine that looks like it's selling mattresses. right? Again, kind of not the strategy that we typically use for advertising medical care. And so in some communities, when buprenorphine providers came into town, maybe were not actually doing good care, buprenorphine made it into the streets and became a substitute for opioids for people that were already addicted. And what that has done is created a real barrier to expansion of care because some communities are afraid and they think that buprenorphine itself is actually the problem. But when we do surveys among people who have misused buprenorphine, taken somebody else's, taken more than they were supposed to, what we find is that the common factors that lead to this are lack of available treatment and trying to treat their own withdrawal. But the consequences are grave. So this is a sign from the Kenton County Courthouse here in Kentucky. I'm not going to comment on the spelling errors. You can figure those ones out yourself. But it says, for Suboxone users, if you want probation or diversion and you're on Suboxone, you must be weaned off by the time of your sentencing date. So here we have a system where we have patients with a medical condition going into care, doing well, getting better, and then being told that in order for them to be released from the criminal justice system or for them to be able to get their children back, get the custody of their children back, that they actually have to come off of the treatment that is helping them. And the thing that irks me the most is I don't think there's any other medical condition in this country where we have judges or lawyers or social workers or lay people who don't actually have a license to practice medicine telling patients what they can and cannot do around their own medical care. So we have been investigating some novel long-acting formulations of buprenorphine, and there are a number of benefits to long-acting formulations, just as there are for other disorders, including, convenience for the patient, producing more stable blood levels, and that a physician can be confident that the person is adherent to their medication. But in this case, I think the benefits to society may be more important in some regard, because this reduces the need for a substantial drug supply at home and reduces the risk of overdose and accidental ingestion, and there have been pediatric overdose deaths from buprenorphine, and minimizes the risk of misuse, abuse, and diversion. And so I think if there's an inherent bias against buprenorphine because it actually is an active, psychoactive agent as opposed to naltrexone, which is an antagonist and is the preferred medication by the criminal justice system. I think if the excuse has been that there's misuse and diversion of the drug, if we can get the sustained release formulations into practice, that will eliminate that argument and hopefully help to expand care. So I'm going to talk about two different products that we had the opportunity to work on. The first is an implant, and the second is an injectable formulation. And the implant is kind of reminiscent of implantable birth control. So on the far right, you can see there's a little kind of matchstick size rod, and you use 4 of these and you insert them under the skin. So this is a little complicated because not only do you need to have a license to practice and prescribe buprenorphine, but you also have to have someone else who has the ability to actually do the procedure, and those aren't always the same person. But this implant will provide coverage for 6 full months. So once the patient receives the implant, they're good for 6 months. These are data just showing the comparison of the implant versus sublingual tablet buprenorphine, which is the standard of care, over a course of 6 months. And you can see the retention is the line function in the top. And so the probufene group was retained very well. And in the end, this was a non-inferiority study because they were comparing two active agents. It was deemed that probufene was non-inferior, which is not the same as equally effective, but non-inferior to sublingual buprenorphine, and so it met the standard for approval. These are the data from the primary analysis just viewed a different way. And so in the upper row, you're looking at the primary analysis that was 4 of 6 months of complete abstinence. And you can see that for the implant group, the abstinence rates were over 96%. and for the sublingual group, 87%. And in the second line of data, for those who were abstinent continuously for 6 months, you can see that the numbers were 86 and 71. So not perfect, but none of us are, but very, very good. And I think the thing that's remarkable about this study is that the overall retention rate was about 94%. These were stable patients who were already on buprenorphine, who were brought into this. And in clinical trials for substance use disorders, we tend to have poor retention. And retention is commonly 50% or less. And so the fact that we could retain people for 6 months at this high rate demonstrates that when you have an effective treatment, people do well and they stay in care. The subcutaneous buprenorphine injectable is called CAM2038. It's not yet approved. I should say, so Probufin was approved in 2016, and we do use it in our clinic, and the patients really, really like it a lot. The subcutaneous buprenorphine is still in development, and this product uses a nanotechnology so that there's a very tiny injection that goes under the skin, and the formulation can be for either 1 week or for 4 weeks, and comes in a very broad range of doses. And so this will really provide maximum flexibility to clinicians. I want to say when it gets approved, if it gets approved. Here at the University of Kentucky, we did both the pivotal phase 2 and pivotal phase 3 study for this product. So I'm going to just show you a little bit about these data. So the first study was looking at opioid blockade, and I had mentioned that earlier as one of the ways that buprenorphine and other medications may work to help reduce illicit drug use. And that's what the aim of this study was. We wanted to look at whether or not the weekly product could produce robust opioid blockade. And so what we did was we screened individuals who were physically dependent on opioids, who had active opioid use disorder, but were not seeking treatment for their disorder at the time. And after a very careful screening, they are admitted into our inpatient CCTS unit, where they underwent some challenges with hydromorphone. So hydromorphone is a very high abuse liability agent that people like. It's similar to heroin in head-to-head comparisons. And so we use that because it's much easier than using heroin in the hospital. Once they were exposed to doses of 0, 6, and 18 milligrams of hydromorphone in randomized order, if their pattern of responding matched some specified criteria that the FDA had set, then they would be randomized to receive either 24 milligrams or 32 milligrams of subcutaneous buprenorphine. And so the design was fairly simple. This was one of our shorter studies, actually, at the inpatient unit. They would receive their dose under blind conditions on day 0. And then over the next 6 days, they would repeat those hydromorphone challenges twice in randomized order, getting 1 dose of drug each day. And then we gave them a second injection on day 7 and repeated. And throughout this, we also collected blood samples, and we collect a lot of physiological data as well. But this was the primary outcome for the FDA, and that was ratings by the volunteers, where they are asked, at this moment, my liking for this drug is, and they have to fill it in from a scale of 0 to 100. And 50 is neutral, and going up to 100 is that they like it, going below 50 is that they dislike it. And you can see at baseline that first dose response function. I'm not sure which one I'm going to, on the left-hand side, that there's a nice dose-related increase in ratings of liking for hydromorphone, as you would expect. In this case, the volunteers were being maintained on morphine around the clock because they were physically dependent, and so they would be in withdrawal if we didn't do that. We withheld their morphine dose the night before each of these challenge sessions. At the point where they get where the first arrow is, that's where they get their first injection of CAM2038. And what you can see is that the response to hydromorphone is immediately suppressed. And it remains suppressed for the duration of that week. And then after the second injection, it is also very low, negligible, compared to the baseline. And these are data for an opioid withdrawal score. Withdrawal is really problematic to manage and really a big trigger for people to relapse. So we wanted to be sure that we were getting a good signal here too. So looking at a commonly used instrument called the CALS, you can see that after the first injection on day 1, that the opioid withdrawal reports were reduced significantly near to zero and remained so for the duration of the study. This describes the design of the phase 3 study. So this was a very large outpatient multi-site clinical trial for which we served as the lead site. And this has a lot of information on the slide, but the main things to know is that there were two groups. One that was assigned to receive sublingual buprenorphine, which is the standard of care, and the other that got the injectable. However, the study was done under double-blind conditions, so that if you were in the injectable group, your injections were active, but every day you took sublingual placebo tablets. And the opposite was true for those who had the active tablets. They were getting placebo injections. And so this was to blind the treatment. The first phase of the study for 12 weeks looked at the weekly formulation. And then the second phase looked at the monthly formulation. And we looked also at the transition between those two to make sure that people didn't become destabilized when they moved from the weekly to the monthly. And these are the findings. So this also was a non-inferiority study. It's not ideal, and in my personal opinion, unethical to do a study where you have a placebo control arm in this condition because people die. And we have effective treatments against which to compare it. So in that case, you use an active control, and a non-inferiority design is the way that you assess whether or not it was efficacious. And so in this case, anything around the 0 mark would mean that the two groups were similar, so that there was no differences in superiority. And if you look at the bottom, this is the actual primary outcome for the FDA. You can see that it actually slightly favors the CAM product, and that was a response rate definition. And then the one that's shown in the top for EMA, that's actually the one for registration with the European Medicines Agency. So I want to talk a little bit about management of opioid withdrawal. As I've already said, and I hope that you'll take the message away, detoxification alone is not an efficacious treatment for opioid use disorder and is actually a risk factor for overdose and death. However, safely managing withdrawal is important for a number of reasons. Patients make treatment transitions. They may want to go from an agonist therapy to an antagonist therapy. They may adjust their dose. They might find themselves in a circumstance where they're not able to access their medication. Or when someone is required to have medication-free status, it's a desire by the patient or maybe a requirement because of their employment. So one of the things that we're able to do in the human laboratory is we're able to look at the preclinical literature to try and understand the neuropharmacological underpinnings of the opioid system and to see whether or not we can identify other systems that may be interacting with the opioid system and use that, capitalize on that, to modify the response in opiate use disorder. And so one of the things that we know is that opioid and cannabinoid systems exhibit bidirectional interactions. Preclinical studies have shown that CB1, that's cannabinoid 1 receptor agonist, can reduce opioid withdrawal and slow the development of tolerance, and CB1 antagonists can actually precipitate withdrawal. So the question that we asked in this study was, can a CB1 agonist, in this case we used dronabinol, reduce opioid withdrawal signs and symptoms in humans? And so in this study, it was an inpatient study as well, we enrolled individuals with physical dependence on opioids, and we maintained them comfortably for the duration of the study around the clock with oxycodone. During that period, then we conducted sessions following double-blind omission of their maintenance dose. So we're able to, instead of give them their oxycodone, we're able to substitute placebo that looks the same and allow for a bit of withdrawal to emerge so that we can measure that and then see whether or not our intervention actually changes the response to that. And so this slide illustrates the primary outcome for the study. These are ratings of how severe your withdrawal is. And if on the left are the data for dronabinol, and on the right are the data for oxycodone. And you can see at baseline, people are rating very high levels of withdrawal. They're very uncomfortable. It's 80 out of 100. So they're really feeling sick, and they've got a lot of different withdrawal symptoms, and they're not particularly happy with us, honestly. And then what we can do is we can substitute a different dose of medication to see what the response is. So if you look on the right-hand side at the oxycodone response, here we're substituting an opioid, right? We're substituting the one that they actually are on already as the positive control. And you can see that we get a nice dose-dependent reduction in ratings of withdrawal, and this parallels a lot of other measures that are sensitive to withdrawal. And on the right, you can see that we also are seeing some dose-dependent reduction in opioid withdrawal by dronabinol. So there's something to this idea that the two are interacting. Although at the highest dose of 20 milligrams of dronabinol, we never see a reduction that is as robust as oxycodone. That's not terribly surprising because we think it's going to be an indirect action anyway, but it's a very provocative finding because here we're finding some real evidence that these systems have some meaningful interaction in humans. And so one could say, well, why don't you just go to a higher dose? That would be the next logical thing to do and see if you can get a more robust effect. But in this case, as we monitor the safety of our volunteers, which is of utmost importance during these types of studies, what we see is that people's heart rate is elevated because they've got an autonomic hypersensitivity because of the withdrawal. And you can see that the heart rate is reduced on the right-hand side by oxycodone, but that heart rate is increased by dronabinol in a dose-dependent way. We actually had gone and tested a slightly higher dose, and we had what I would consider a meaningful adverse event because we had sustained high levels of tachycardia. So this is an example, one that not everything works. There's lots of failed experiments, but that the ability to have this type of close monitoring and do these type of laboratory studies allows you to assess a lot of signals simultaneously for proof of concept and for safety. In contrast, we were involved in a study a number of years ago where we looked at lofexidine for the management of spontaneous opioid withdrawal. And in this study, rather than maintaining people on an opioid and doing kind of that substitution procedure that I described, instead, we actually spontaneously withdrew them in the hospital setting. This is a harder type of study to do because what happens is people leave. They're unhappy, they're not feeling well. Even if you give them ancillary meds to treat their symptoms, they'll depart. And this happens in the hospital all the time if we're not treating people who are dependent because they're uncomfortable and they're in withdrawal. And it's really important in that case that we keep them because they've got another medical complication that we're trying to treat. But you can see the contrast in effects between lofexidine and dronabinol here because lofexidine also reduced withdrawal symptoms. It wasn't a wildly robust signal, although this was reviewed by the FDA just last month, and the advisory committee voted for approval because they felt that the signal was strong enough. But lofexidine, as an alpha-adrenergic agonist, actually reduces the hyperactivity in the autonomic system, and you see a reduction in heart rate instead. I'm going to talk just a moment about novel approaches. And I didn't see my dear friend and colleague, Sandy Comer, in the audience, but she's speaking there. There she is. Hi, Sandy. I put this in just for you, actually. So I have to say, if you have an opportunity to see Sandy talk at the Bluegrass Neuroscience meeting this afternoon, please do. And Sandy and I have worked together for many, many years, and we have a number of collaborative studies. The CAM study, actually, we were both authors on. And I'm just going to talk about this because I think it's very provocative. And this is a project that Sandy is leading, and we just submitted a grant last week, I think, something like that. And she graciously offered to have us serve as a second site for the study if it were to be funded. So there's a lot of interest right now in developing targeted vaccines because they could be used as a primary treatment or they could be used as an adjunct on top of the other treatments that we already have available. And so while this is really appealing and promising, to date there really have not been any vaccine products for substance use disorders that have made it to the market, although a number of them have gotten into humans. So there have been nicotine vaccine studies and there have been studies on cocaine vaccines as well. A number of academic laboratories are working on development of single target and multivalent vaccines and targeting an array of opioids from heroin to fentanyl. So part of the problem, of course, is that opioids don't all have the same structural configuration, and vaccines are very, very specific, looking for that chemical structure. And so if you had a product that was only going to target, say, oxycodone, there would be no reason that somebody then couldn't use heroin or fentanyl. But the ability to develop these multivalent vaccines that actually link multiple things into the same vaccine holds some promise. And so the way that they work is that vaccines generate anti-drug antibodies that bind in plasma to block entry to the brain. So basically they're acting like a big sponge. So if someone's vaccinated and they have a sufficient antibody response, then when they use the drug, it's basically mopped up and it doesn't get to cross the blood-brain barrier and thereby eliminates the response. And here are some data from the preclinical studies for one of the vaccines on oxycodone. And what you're looking at are self-administration rates of oxycodone in rats. This is a great model that we have in the substance abuse area. And you can see that for the placebo vaccine, the KLH, that they're learning and rapidly increasing their self-administration of oxycodone because they find it reinforcing. But the animal that's vaccinated with the active vaccine is not so interested and has a kind of low and stable baseline level of responding that appears to even be declining at the end. So I share this just because it's provocative, and we hope that maybe 2 years from now we'll have some data that parallel this in the humans. So I just want to summarize at this point and say that from the treatment landscape, a number of new products are in the pipeline or have been recently approved. And considering we only had, we had 2 drugs approved basically in the 1970s and didn't have anything approved again until after 2000, the flow of new developments is exciting because we need everything that we can have in our armamentarium to try and fight this crisis. So we're hoping that this will allow us to expand our ability to care for patients. The long-acting formulations should also decrease the risk of misuse and diversion and accidental overdose. All of these are unintentional harms that hamper treatment expansion. And they can also significantly decrease the need for supervised dosing because we have a real workforce problem in this area. It would be great to be able to have people on sustained release formulations and be receiving care by telehealth or telemedicine, especially in rural areas. There are a number of other innovative approaches, including analgesics without abuse potential and vaccine therapies that are in development. And then I want to summarize just about leveraging our clinical science. So clinical studies in the lab and clinic can be used to address many critical questions before doing a big scale randomized trial, including safety, abuse liability, assessing reinforcing efficacy, and doing translational work to look at proof of concept for pharmacological efficacy. And these studies can have direct impact on regulatory decision-making, physician practice and prescribing guidelines, and the approval of new treatments. And with that, I want to just thank a few people. First, I want to thank our research participants for their contributions to the field, because without them, we wouldn't have any data. And we're very grateful to the CCTS nursing staff and our own research staff who protect the safety of our participants and the integrity of our studies. And thanks to Marco Prevatoni for sharing the vaccine slides. And of course, I need to thank the National Institute on Drug Abuse, the National Center for Advancing Translational Sciences, Braeburn Pharmaceuticals, and World Meds, who helped support, fund the studies that I presented today. And with that, I thank you for your attention.